Next up we have Dr. Matt Morgan, who is an intensive care doctor at University Hospital Wales. So he's been on the front line of COVID for the last, I don't know how many months, maybe 4 or 5 months, maybe longer. But he's going to tell us his experiences, and I'm looking forward to this talk. And if you've got any burning questions afterwards, we're going to ask him some questions as well. So, Dr. Matt Morgan.
I have some bad news. I know you're here to listen to some amazing music, to Holly and to Firewood Island, but before then, I need you to come with me on a night shift for 13 hours. I'm going to hold your hand. There's going to be some tough times. There's going to be some sad times. There's going to be some hope, but there's going to be an endless supply of Haribos and coffee. So if you're happy to come with me on a night shift, you've just parked up in the car park actually, and you're about to hold my hand and join me on intensive care. Okay, so it's about 8 o'clock at night. I've just arrived at the car park in Cardiff to start my second night shift in a row. Last night was pretty busy with critically ill people with COVID and with not COVID. I'm not wearing any works clothes today, which feels a bit weird, so I'll be dressing into scrubs or a surgical outfit when I go in, so I don't have to take dirty clothes home with me. I've tried to listen to something different on the radio on the way, rather than the news or a podcast about medicine. I've put some easy listening acoustic music on the way, and I think that's been fairly good. Anyway, there's a long 13 hours ahead of us. There's not many cars in the car park, actually. It's Sunday night, and I will see you all in the morning. So I wanted this talk to bring you into my world using a small door to a big world. Instead of the things you see on the media, the things you read in the newspaper, I wanted to show you what working in the intensive care unit in Cardiff, actually, just half an hour up the road, during the early times of the pandemic of COVID was like. Now, I wrote a book about intensive care about a year or so ago, and the reason I wrote that was to try to give people an insight into the world of intensive care, because I thought it was amazing, but it was a word that not many people knew or understood. Was I to know there was about to be a global pandemic where intensive care would be on the lips of Boris Johnson and the government and the news every day, perhaps I wouldn't have written that. But actually, intensive care as a place started with a global viral pandemic. It started in 1952 with this little girl, who was a 12-year-old girl called Vivi, who had polio in Copenhagen, and that was the start of the intensive care unit. And yet here we stand again in the midst of another global viral pandemic in intensive care. And like I said, I'm going to tell this story through some video, which I captured at the time in car parks, in staff rooms, in the intensive care unit, and I'm going to tell it through words. Because in fact, that day I left and didn't know when I was going to come home, I stole my daughter's Harry Potter diary, which she's never forgiven me for, and wrote some things in there as we go along. So that's going to be our journey today, by listening to some words and by looking at some videos. And the first entry is Tuesday the 10th of March. This morning, I packed my car with a sleeping bag, roll-up mat, food, toothpaste and clothes, so I'm not sure when I'm going to get back home again. I switched off Radio 4 and I put on Mellow Magic. I also had upset my wife, Alison, after sending her an email last night entitled, Things You Should Know in Case I Die. Along with passwords and the location of important documents that she can never seem to find, I'd written, I've had a bloody wonderful life. I've travelled, I've partied, I've had 2 amazing children, I've spent time with friends, family, I've done things I've never dreamed of. I love my job, even though it can be tough, it can be dangerous. Touching the lives of others is the best feeling in the world. The start of my and your standard 13-hour night shift tonight. The first challenge is where to go. For the last week, there have been huge changes in the location of beds in the hospital. Intensive care now is everywhere. We have just one patient at the minute being treated in the intensive care unit with coronavirus. I go and check on him, make sure his ventilator is helping him the best it can. Then I get a photo on my phone. My Canadian friend shows me a photo of where hand sanitizer has been ripped off the wall in his hospital. This hasn't happened yet here, but who knows what the future holds. My lunch today, a cookie. It's hard coming home after a day treating the sickest of patients, and I've been incredibly busy since the start of the COVID outbreak. My wife Alison has called me a body with a phone attached to it. I try to do bath and bed for the girls, but my mind is elsewhere. Tonight I'm going to sleep in the spare room because I've been surrounded by viruses all day.
Right, well, it's my first day in a pretty long run of shifts. I've only been in the hospital for about 2 hours in the COVID area, and I just wanted to show you what the personal protective equipment actually does to you. And this is just 2 hours in that area. Yet alone what the nursing staff and cleaners and other parts of the hospital have to go through. But you can see it's really pretty sore at the sides, behind your ear, on your nose, and I've even worn one of these protective parts actually, which can come off. But it's pretty uncomfortable. I'm looking at myself on this phone, I'm looking pretty tired, and it's just a couple of hours in. We'll see you later on.
So like I said, tonight's going to be a tough night shift actually. On average, about 25% of patients who go to intensive care will die. That's before COVID. And in the early days of COVID, that mortality rate, that death rate was much higher. And lots of the times people ask, that's a stressful job, how do you manage? Why don't you go home and feel sad about that? But for me, seeing people who are at the brink of life, actually doesn't make me ruminate on the sadness. It makes me appreciate life. It makes me appreciate here, the trees, the sun, the family, the friends we've got. And so I think that's important to remember as well. But at the times where things were tough, it was tough. Sunday the 10th of May. COVID has brought new memories for us all to carry. In a decade's time, I'll remember pressing the keyboard, the rubber keys on a phone, ringing a family about to tell them the worst news of their life. I now realise, above all, the reason I wanted to do medicine isn't because of science, isn't because of medicine, it's because I want to communicate with patients and with their families and with colleagues. Communication is healthcare's most valuable and yet most dangerous procedure. Verbal dexterity matters much more than manual dexterity. Yet COVID has stolen face-to-face communication with families when they need it the most. Instead, tonight I'll break bad news through the twisted cord of a telephone where the power of silence can be mistaken for a hang-up. I know from personal experience when my family have been ill that the sound of your own ringtone on a television programme can induce panic when you're waiting for news of the loved one. What if it's the hospital, you think? So now, every time I ring a family, I try to start my phone calls with, don't worry, this isn't a bad news phone call. Not this time. This time that would be a lie. It is bad news. The worst. I begin, I'm so sorry to do this over the phone. The call ends with quiet sobbing. We promise to hold that patient's hand, to play his favourite song, to tell them that their family loves them. Love them. Because soon after they die. And those are now the people that I and many of my colleagues carry with us. So too the nurses, the physiotherapists, the receptionists who file the death certificates, the cleaners who clean the empty beds. We all carry COVID, not on our skin, but in our hearts. How does it feel to work in intensive care during a deadly global viral pandemic? Unsurprisingly, the number of appropriate analogies is pretty small. In the early days, back in March, it felt a bit like being a first-time parent, living in a one-bedroom flat when your baby comes a month early and there's a surprise. It's triplets. You start parenthood feeling knackered after weeks of sleepless nights, your good intentions to paint the nursery have all gone. Your bags are not packed. You worry about your ability to care for more children than your hands can carry. You also worry how you're going to get through this unscathed. Even if you have enough cots and enough nappies, the physical infrastructure of your flat is not fit for purpose. Yet you do get through it. Adrenaline, love, and hope are your fuel. The early days are hard, the later days even harder. But your children survive. You change your flat to better care for them. You get systems in place. You find others that you can rely upon. You cry, but you laugh, sometimes out loud. Will you come through unscathed? No. But most of the scars are ones that will heal and remind you of what you have achieved. Life will never be the same again. Some parts worse, some parts eventually may be better. But it's after the novel has settled down and people stop offering you help that the tough times begin. We'll only really know the impact of COVID when the worst has passed. During the crisis, cracks will show, but when calm has returned, people will reflect and process what has happened. The times when I feel upset or angry now, when I'm caring for a patient during a procedure, it's actually when we see the effects afterwards. And that's not in days or weeks or months, it'll be longer. The ripples will extend out beyond the walls of the intensive care unit, into the hospital, beyond healthcare, into life, into your lives. And so in this time of turbulence, most important thing we must remember to not lose is not patience, it's not science, it's ourselves.
This is definitely not how I was expecting to be spending Easter. It's gone midnight on Easter Sunday. It's another tough shift in intensive care, and it's been a really hard one tonight for staff and for patients, and absolutely for patients' families. We've sadly had somebody who's died and their family couldn't be with them at the time. They asked whether we can hold their hand, which we did, and whether we could play their favourite song, which we did at their bedside. But it must be so hard for them not being here. It's not how I expected to spend Easter. It's also my wife's 40th birthday in a day or so, and to be completely honest, I haven't done very much for her. I've ordered some last minute presents, but they haven't arrived because the post is delayed. I had organised a surprise party for her, but that's obviously cancelled now as well. So I'm feeling pretty guilty about not supporting my children because it's Easter, and my wife perhaps as well as I should have done. But I'm here trying to support patients, families, staff, the NHS to get through COVID. Let's hope next Easter is very different.
Dark is a way, light is a place. Probably my favourite lyric from Dylan Thomas, written from a poem on his 40th. And as I say, intensive care can be a sad place, but also sometimes the darkness can show you the light. Actually, it's seeing people who are unwell makes us appreciate life now. We only get one. So that flat tire, that tax bill, that thing that doesn't quite work, actually that doesn't matter. What matters is now, the trees, the friends, the family that we've got. And for me, that doesn't make me sad. That kind of makes me happy. And actually, through the intensive care unit where I've worked during COVID, we run research trials. We now have better survival rates than at the start of the pandemic, probably 50% higher. We have drugs that work. We have a vaccine that will probably be here in the early next year, most likely. There are things that we can do can help. And even when there aren't, it's not called the intensive therapy unit anymore. It's called the intensive care unit. There is care there no matter what. Even if there isn't a treatment that works, there is always care there. There's a nurse at your bedside. But it's also been tough for staff. And when I say staff, I don't just mean doctors and nurses. I feel uncomfortable with that term hero. In fact, I've been just going to work the same as I always do. I've got paid the same as I always am. I've had food delivered to the hospital by Michelin star chefs, which has been the best food I've eaten in 5 years. We are not heroes. The heroes are those who've been through hardship. The families, the patients, the musicians who haven't been paid, actually. For healthcare workers, actually, we've been probably one of the better managed during this crisis. And so actually, dark is a way, but there is a place at the end, and that place is light.
Well, it's 12, 13 hours after I last sat in this car and turned the engine off, and here we are again. It's pretty dark actually. In fact, I'm going to turn this light on so you can see a bit better. It's been a strange day today. It's been a day of two halves. In some ways, people are getting used to the rhyme and the reason of the day. They're getting faster with putting on the PPE. They're getting familiar with the way patients respond who are critically ill with this disease. So they've been all really good points. It's also been a tough day, and it's been a tough day because today is the first time where people have lost a colleague, somebody who we all know fairly well has died, someone who has worked in the hospital for a long time, and that's always going to set people back. It'll make us think about them and their family, and it also makes you realise that this is a disease which we're all vulnerable to, no matter if you work in the hospital, don't work in the hospital. And that makes you think, especially now as I drive home to see the family and my two girls. Anyway, I'm going to put some music on. I'm going to maybe even sing and get back home.
And the truth is, I did sing. In fact, I put on the playlist for Between the Trees that I was hoping to come to in May, which I'm at. I'm not going to tell you which band because it'll offend some of them, I'm sure. But I think it's important also to remember joy. It's okay to feel joy. It's okay to be happy in a time that is sometimes sad. It was my wife's 40th birthday. Yes, we didn't have a party, but we still smiled. We still did things we enjoy. We threw water balloons at each other. And at the end of that car journey, even though it was sad, even though there was families that we supported, I turned the music up loud, I wound the windows down, I drank a strong coffee, and I did sing, actually. So I just want you to remember that joy is what we strive towards, even when things are tough. And I'm just going to leave you with this one last thing to think about. The dark times sometimes come just before the dawn. Although for many this crisis may be waning, for staff that have been there in the dark times, now actually is when they need the help. Please turn the hands that were used to clap for us to pull us back onto our feet. It's fine to drop a ball as long as that ball is not made of glass. Nye Bevan and Martin Joseph has said that the purpose of power is to give it away. And this crisis has been fought not with nurses, not with cleaners, not with doctors, not with healthcare workers, but the delivery drivers and the people around us, people like you. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for doing the things that work. Thank you for helping everybody in this crisis. We have the power to choose the future by the things and the actions we do. But now we seem in a hurry to return to something people call normal. But I'm in a hurry to remember which parts of normal are really worth returning to. Thanks.